Hey, Sydney, do you consider yourself to be a high value male? I ask this because the other day I was getting ready to go out. I got out the shower and I was getting dressed and I realized I had a bit of hair somewhere on my person. Not my hair. You know this if you lived around someone who has long, straight hair. Sometimes their hair escapes their fucking scalp and then lands on something and then lands on you or whatever. So I felt that also familiar tickle of someone else's hair, i.e., my partner's hair, on my leg. Really up top, nowhere near the butt, but just like, right at the top of my thigh there. And, as you standard procedure, you pincer it between your thumb and your index and then you try to flick it away into the abyss. It lands somewhere. Who cares? Once it's not on you, you don't care. So I was like, all right, there it is. Yeah, got it. And then I went to take that hair off myself. And at that point, I realized that this wasn't a hair that was on my person. This was a hair that I must at some point have swallowed. And it had made most of its way out. And I was now stood in the middle of my room, pulling this hair out of my nether regions in just a t-shirt and nothing else, full Donald Duck costume, fucking having an awakening. And I don't know what the term high value male means, but that was the point I realized that if it does have a definition or a criteria, I will never fit into that fucking criteria. And it just got me thinking. Obviously, Sydney, this is just a voice note that I send to you, my oldest friend on the other side of the world. But to any eavesdroppers, I am Takuzwa Shawa, and you are listening to Ways of Thinking, a show that is about surprisingly transferable skills. And, I think the skill we're going to be looking at today is the one I've just started to learn, or the one I've just embarked on, i.e. podcasting, maybe content creation in general. And specifically, we're going to look at how content creation generates ways of thinking that are applicable to real life. And the reason this all ties in to the whole high value male thing is that I've listened over the years to a lot of podcasts, and they have always been, but have increasingly become dominated by your typical, or dare I say, stereotypical alpha types. These people all have a long laundry list, as long as that hair that I extracted from myself on that fateful day, of ways to improve your life. To address that situation, I have recovered, and it could have been worse. It's not like my girlfriend has dreadlocks. It could have been a lot worse. But with regards to the whole high value thing, the interesting thing I find is that anything that purports to want to improve your life is going to come with elements of truth. And taken in isolation, some of these can actually be good things. Limit your screen time, fail fast, make your bed, whatever it is. But the fact is, the whole high value thing is just the most memeable synecdoche for an entire sort of self-improvement, self-actualization, self-promotion, selfie fucking idea space. This whole mindset movement that we find ourselves in. I guess the problem is, for me, while any one of these bits of advice or mantra, if you will, could be good in isolation, I think if you take the whole corpus on, they kind of act like grasshoppers, right? Like a grasshopper on its own with space is a small, manageable creature. But if you get loads of them and then you put them into a confined space and they rub up against each other, they grow, it triggers something in them, and then they become locusts. So you have these linguistic locusts now swarming our minds and our culture through no fault of their own. They're just doing what they do. And same as most of these content creators, just doing what they do. I guess I can now count myself in that pantheon. Ugh. I can't believe I used the word pantheon and then included myself in that pantheon. However, you can have a super well-meaning content creator like Andrew Huberman, right? And he could give you like a catalog of advice. And even just him, if you don't even look at the entire ecosystem, you just look at this one person, he gives lots of really good advice. But it's also so comprehensive that I think if you followed every single thing that he did, you wouldn't you'd be someone else. Like you wouldn't be like a different man. You wouldn't be like a new you. You'd be another person. And if you don't know who Andrew Huberman is, he's like this hotshot neuroscientist professor from like Stanford, built like a brick shit house. And he looks like he cuts his beard with a samurai sword every morning. He's like, yeah. And then he fucking leaves and he's like, all right, science. But like, I'm a fan. So that's the one point. Like in its entirety, it's got this weird new intractability that I hope to one day put a finger on, right? So, someone like Andrew Huberman will give certain advice. And it's funny because what I think might even be his most important advice might be stuff that I'll never do. Like, okay, so he'll talk about sort of cold exposure, cold showers or having an ice bath. And like he'll explain, in depth the benefits of cold exposure. And I'll be like, oh, yes, interesting. And, he'll be like, cold exposure triggers and releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. And like, that sounds great. And then he's like, and that makes you more alert. And I'm like, okay, and, it builds resilience. I'm like, that's fantastic. Don't even get me started on its effects on dopamine. And I'm like, I see. And I'm like, okay, I believe the science and I trust that science. And it sounds like a worthy exercise. And I ain't doing it. I don't have cold shower money. Like, okay, so like these guys jump into a cold shower or whatever, or an ice bath, which is, again, commendable and never say never, but they have this cold exposure. And then they step out onto like a heated floor with like fucking beautiful contrast and like dick still big, even though they just got waterboarded at like fucking 4 degrees C. If I had a cold shower, I'd then have to like step out of my bath because my bath and my shower are the same thing. And then I'd have to like swing my leg out and avoid roundhousing the shower screen that's already looking a bit ropey. And then I have to like shuffle my ass past this window that's like clearly shut. I can see the window is closed, but I can still feel a draft coming through it onto my body. And it's like, and like, my point is that I'm pretty 80-20 with a lot of this shit. Even if it's someone as flipping dogmatic or, someone as emphatic, if you will, as like a David Goggins, I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll take it in small doses, thanks. And I think that's okay. And I get that this is well-intentioned, beneficial, and insightful. But I feel like when a lot of people give us this advice, we often edit out the part where they go into the sauna afterwards, right? And then we're like, why can't I just flip and do that? It's like, well, because you don't have a sauna, bro, I suppose what I really want to talk about when I look at that relationship between being a creator and a person who just has a life is this idea of comparison, right? Because I think all these gurus and moguls, just by virtue of their existence and by a result of perhaps their success or their conviction even, they inevitably invite comparison. And you all end up comparing yourself as a person and as a professional. I don't think it can be avoided. And I'm not even trying to really put a moral judgment on that. I'm just saying that it's something to be aware of, like even in a purely practical sense. And this might make sense at the end, but I think comparison has been a major theme leading up to starting this podcast, in the sense that I have always had a tendency to compare my success or lack of success to that of others. I'm reasonably comfortable in my own skin, but it's happened on a subconscious level. I've linguistically told myself that I am on my own path, but maybe the body's been keeping the score, right? But you'll hear a lot about comparison if you're an ambitious person. And the prevailing advice is, hey, just do you. Don't compare yourself to others. And my underlying response seems to be, I'm gonna compare myself to others. I think that there's obviously a healthy way to compare one-to-one, and there's obviously an unhealthy way to do that. The question is it adaptive or maladaptive, I suppose? And oftentimes when if you consider that example of the cold baths going into a contrastingly comfortable environment, the problem isn't with comparison per se. The problem is with selective comparison. When we compare ourselves with others maladaptively, we filter for the things that we want to hate ourselves for the most. Okay, so like I've listened to a lot more podcast hours than most people, and my creative impulse to make one has always butted up against that comparative impulse. I listen to shits and gigs, and I'm like, well, yeah, I don't have chemistry with anyone like that. I'm not going to record a podcast. Or, you know, you listen to Modern Wisdom and like Chris Williams is like stringing words together like he's got a flipping large language model microchip like implanted in his brain. And these are the kind of things that like I probably spent way too much time grappling with before I got started on this podcast. But the process of overcoming them, I think, has sort of been writ large in the actions that have led to this moment. And so, for instance, the whole idea of not having someone to bounce off of in real time in the room, you know, the very fact that and all the friends that I would like to work on this with are either too far away on the other side of the world or are too busy. The discomfort of recording solo exceeded the discomfort of not recording at all. So that seemed to have solved itself. And then I dealt with the whole solo recording, that mic fright we talked about in that I talked about in the previous recording. I dealt with that mic fright by formatting this as just a series of voice messages that I'm going to send you, my good friend Sydney, on the other side of the world, and everyone else can just listen in. And I also realized at some point that all of these people to whom I've been listening for all these years are going to sound impossibly witty and eloquent to me because, you know, I'm a maniac who listens to everything at double speed. Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh would sound like a fucking raconteur at double speed, right? He'd sound like George Carlin. And, you know, never mind that they have teams and they have time to actually work on making their efforts look effortless. And so that's what I mean when I say that you will filter for the things that you want to hate yourself for the most, right? When you compare yourself to others. And as long as you don't do that, as long as you're fair about the true material factors that make the difference and then continue, I feel like you might sort of enrich your life. Maybe. So I did that first recording, having overcome mic fright and having framed things in a way that actually feels authentic to me. And although it was a little rough, trust me, it was rougher before it was edited, right? But that editing process is really what got me reflecting on this comparison thing. Okay, so that first intro episode, I could have chucked that in the bin and started again, right? But I think it was important to keep it. So let's just look at some notes on that super rough little episode. The very first thing I realized when I was editing that little piece is that I say that phrase, you know, a lot. I say it a lot. How many times have I said this without even noticing it? You know, just, you know, you see, there it is again. And so I'm going to try to cut down on that. Not for any self-improvement purposes, honestly, just because I hate editing that. There's so many of them. It's like it's a flipping deluge over here. And, you know, I'm starting now. I'm going to stop saying, you know, so much. One thing I noticed is that I stumbled over sentences that I would often just rattle off, you know, if we were just speaking in real time. For instance, I think I misspoke in the weirdest ways. I said that culture determines how some people think, which for some reason feels like the stupidest thing I've ever said, because obviously culture will determine how all people think, right? I said long-term interviews instead of long-form interviews, but that seems to be a bit of a happy accident because I actually do like the idea of interviewing someone over the space of whatever it is, a week, a month, a year, and presenting those podcast episodes as one self-contained little piece. I mentioned the idea of an asteroid hitting the Earth, and for some reason I'm kicking myself for not making that distinction between an asteroid and a meteor and a meteorite, and that's just something I'm going to have to get used to about myself. Or improve on over time. But there seems to be a weird, maybe insecure impulse to say, I know the difference, all right? And that, you know, that just makes me laugh. I also realized that I struggled to clearly state the kind of people I want to talk to on ways of thinking. I can't remember the exact list right now, but I think it's safe to say that when it's not me solo and it's not me and a friend, ways of thinking will be probing the brains of experts, scholars, enthusiasts, and survivors. I think these are people who have something to add to that library of human knowledge. We should add adventurers to that. So experts, scholars, enthusiasts, survivors, and adventurers. The other thing that I noticed that was funny was that I actually spent quite a lot of time preparing for that ep. I don't know how much of that time was actual prep versus perseveration, but it was just so funny that I spent so much time working on it. And then after editing and adding the changes that I wanted to add that are quite experimental, I don't know how they're going to pan out. But it was just so funny that I put all that work into it. And then I ended up with like 10 minutes of footage. I tell you, man, I thought I'd done War and Peace on that, but that's just funny. And I think it also just comes down to, how can I put this? I think it's funny that I was nervous and I was worried that I would commit all these faux pas that I've mentioned. I was worried that I would stumble over my own words and look silly. But that's silly because there's no one else in the room with me, right? That could have been my 89th take of that intro, and you would be none the wiser. I could have started off with a litany of racial and sexist and like anti-Semitic and homophobic slurs and epithets, ones that would have offended even the most anti-fragile motherfuckers out there. I could say some really hurtful shit like this. See, it's like it never even happened. It was just funny to actually experience that rather than simply simulate it in my own brain as we tend to do. But these insights just highlight how audio editing is like plastic surgery for the voice. And I'd expand on that by saying editing yourself is like plastic surgery for the soul. Because my recording was rough as hell, and I think my soul is rough as hell, and I have slapped some double D's on both of those. So I'm keeping that recording for posterity. I like the idea of watching things improve. So if you are listening, thank you for joining me and listening to me while I sniff my own brain farts. So editing has become an interesting tool for self-reflection. It's interestingly transferable in that regard. And I know this seems obvious. It does seem obvious that once you listen to yourself talk, you self-edit. What I'm trying to say is it's profound to realize that when you start editing yourself as a product, you also start editing yourself as a person. And it sets off an interesting feedback loop of speaking, listening to yourself, subsequently altering yourself accordingly, and so on. And I've even found that I'm more deliberate in my day-to-day in-person interactions. I'm a little more chill. And part of that might just be the afterglow of popping that solo recording cherry. Ironically, ways of thinking has become a way of doing. But I wonder really if it's because when I've experienced any sort of stage fright or mic fright, really the audience I've been most afraid of is myself. And that realization has spurred me on in a very interesting way. Actually, I've even realized that when I picture stage fright, and I don't know if this happens to you, but when I have anything akin to stage fright, the crowd that I picture or the audience that I picture is actually quite lifeless, right? They're like an AI generated mid-journey stable diffusion crowd just sat there. And I have a feeling that if I walked into that crowd and I lifted their masks, it would all just be me. It would just be me under that mask being like, well, I don't know, man, you put me here, And yeah, that's interesting. I'll stop saying interesting so much at some point. All I'm saying at this point is it feels transformative to finally step into the unknown. And it feels even more transformative to do it in a way that is authentic. And the next thing I really want to talk about right now is this idea of authenticity. We're talking about how content creation and self-reflection, we're talking about how content creation and self-reflection exist in a continuum. And we're talking about how comparison is not to be misconstrued with maladaptive comparison or selective comparison. And authenticity comes into that. It's really hard to be authentic, I feel, if all your actions are orchestrated to directly address someone else's output, especially if you don't know what's gone into generating those results for those people to whom you compare yourself with. And it kind of goes full circle for me, in the sense that when I think of authenticity and I think of buzzwords, like I mentioned before, like a high value male, even slightly more neutral ones like mindset, I kind of realize that I'm not a big proponent of these buzzwords. It's not that I'm not a fan. I understand why they exist, but I feel like they get picked up by greater society and then they don't get advanced. It's like, we've got it now. We don't have to actually get down to a first principle of what that actually means. It's like we've got enough to use it. And I wonder if we've all just consumed so much advertising-driven information that our descriptive capabilities are reduced to that advertising level, right? Consider that a lot of these buzzwords are quite similar to the same types of buzzwords that you'll hear in ads for like pharmaceuticals. You have to be very careful about whether you say something can do something or helps to do something. And you have to protect yourself in many ways. And I think that when we use a lot of these terms nowadays, we might not be protecting ourselves in the same way that a pharmaceutical company can protect themselves, but we might be protecting ourselves financially in terms of our viability within the overall content, creative commerce ecosystem. So now words like toxic and words like diversity have been over-applied until specificity becomes a casualty of searchability or advertisability. Is that a word? Advertisability. So, we are stuck in a very weird cultural, it might be a death spiral, and I hope it's not, but it's an interesting spiral of sorts, wherein we are very quick to reify abstract concepts, and somehow we're also too quick to abstract concrete terms. It's just anthropologically fascinating that we're in this space, and I hope we survive it. But it does make sense when you consider that the internet, our primary mode of communication and content consumption, runs on advertising. It's all at the back end, right? Like, the free stuff is free because your attention is what's being sold. Even if you're paying for subscriptions now, I think that it's just going to come down to your data and how that can be used to garner more of your attention. You're right. So engineers and UX designers and entrepreneurs and psychologists, they've all worked very hard to make every online action feel simple and easy and even feel cute, right? But every text you send, even like every swipe left or right on Tinder, will detonate this like coronal blast of controlled electrons that then get detected, picked up, logged on this mountain of machinery. And advertising pays for it all on some level. So as a result, we see social media as social, but really the fact is that now every hobby has become a hustle and every platform is a funnel and every hole is a goal. And I'm sure that I get that this is not unique to the internet. I feel like we'd get into much greater depth, a real-time face-to-face on this one. And so that's a conversation for another day. But I do think that the internet has a unique way of amplifying certain aspects of that, psychosocial dynamic. So that is why I think the whole hustle culture, mindset, grindset phenomenon surfaces questions about authenticity. Because I'm absolutely passionate about this podcast, about podcasting as a craft, have been for flipping half my life, it seems, at this point. I'm passionate about connecting with people, all that good stuff. But I'm equally passionate about making films and designing cool shit and making music, making video games, being an entrepreneur. And, I worry that my authenticity won't remain intact if this ever morphs into some sort of prolonged sales pitch. The perils of grift drift seem pretty apparent, but so do the perils of being naive about financial sustainability. Ultimately, I'm scared that I will become a hack if I start monetizing this at some point, But there is, I guess, a pretty good way of thinking about this. And it comes from Margaret Atwood. So in Margaret Atwood's book, Negotiating with the Dead, in which she talks about being a writer, not just writing, but she talks about being a writer, the inner being of a writer. She brings up this distinction, I read it a while ago, but say the distinction between literature and or literary fiction and commercial fiction. And she's talking about this, ongoing debate within her circles about which is better, commercial fiction, literary fiction. And she brings up this distinction that I like to call the Atwood matrix, where, what she says is it's not that one's better than the other. There is good literary fiction and there is good commercial fiction. There is bad literary fiction and there is bad commercial fiction. And normally when we do have this dichotomy, I think it always helps to actually split it up into a little mental amoeba to say, both of these axes go to minus. And that I found that quite helpful. I also heard an interesting saying on this YouTube channel that I discovered recently called Mango Street. And they said that art is having something to say and content is having to say something. So I think when you combine that mantra with the Atwood matrix, you do have something that feels like maybe a way forward if you're someone who's a bit navel-gazy. I've been staring at navels a lot. It seems to be my nature. I just think it's a good way to keep you moving forward. If you're a person who worries that the reality of being a creative seems to only offer two options, one being promotion and the other being supplication. Subscribe to my this, that, da, da, da. And so I do feel like that's something I want to address internally and externally. But really, funnily enough, the most productive way of thinking, when you do still keep that Atwood aspect and the Mango Street aspect in your mind, I think that the one most productive way of thinking ironically came from one of these gurus, and it came from Seth Godin. And he said in a podcast recently that people don't care if you're authentic. They just care if you're consistent.